NEET Crash Course Biology. Now we shall discuss about Plant Kingdom, the chapter. We'll do a quick review of this particular chapter. Now here, Plant Kingdom belongs to the R.H. Whittaker's 5 kingdom classification, as you know. There is a separate kingdom to include fungi and prokaryotes, and algae are also included under kingdom that is Plantae. Okay, so in this chapter we are only going to discuss about some of the primitive plants like algae, which is included under kingdom Plantae, along with avascular plants like bryophytes and vascular plants like pteridophytes, gymnosperms, and the most advanced plants, that is angiosperms. Okay, now what are some of the general characteristics of kingdom Plantae? Now as you can see, it includes algae, it includes bryophytes, which are called the amphibians of the plant kingdom, the pteridophytes, which are the first vascular land plants, and then you have the first seeded plants, which is the gymnosperms, and lastly we have the most advanced seeded and fruit bearing and flower bearing plants, which are referred to as the angiosperms. Basically all plants are multicellular. Of course, when you talk about some of the algae, you do have unicellular forms like Chlamydomonas and Chlorella, etc. But by and large, all of them are multicellular. They are autotrophic, that is, they have a green colored pigment called chlorophyll, and they can manufacture their own food by capturing the carbon dioxide from their surrounding environment. They are eukaryotes, they are advanced cells. Then another most important feature of plant kingdom is they have a cell wall made up of cellulose. They are generally non-motile. You know that most of the plants are fixed to the substratum. They are sedentary, and they may produce, if you talk about some of the lower plants, they don't have true roots. They may have root-like rhizoids, or if you talk about higher plants like gymnosperms and angiosperms, they possess and including pteridophytes, because they have vasculature, they possess true roots for fixation and absorption. They are photosynthetic, having chlorophyll and accessory pigments. Now basically a very important point in plant kingdom is they have two alternating phases in their life. In most plants you will find a diploid phase where all the cells in the body are diploid, and you will find a haploid phase where all the cells in the body are haploid. Of course, the haploid phase is reduced as we move up the ladder in the kingdom Plantae. Okay, generally what do we call this diploid plant? This diploid plant is referred to as a sporophyte, which by asexual reproduction produces the spores which develop into the haploid phase, that is referred to as the gametophyte. So now imagine there is a plant, and this plant is a diploid plant. Okay, now this diploid plant contains, or it participates mostly in, and I'm going to call this diploid plant as a sporophyte. This is just for representation. So this is a sporophyte. This always participates in meiosis. Okay, and when it undergoes meiosis, it produces something called haploid spores. Okay, so these are nothing but the spores, and remember the spores were produced by the plants through meiosis. That's why these are haploid, and these haploid spores will be set free and they will fall on a suitable substratum and they will germinate into a new plant, and this new plant which is now produced will be a gametophyte. It is referred to as a gametophyte. So got a loose idea now. We will discuss in detail in the further slides, but for now remember, generally you will find two different plants in the life cycle of a plant or a typical plant, that is a sporophyte and a gametophyte. A sporophyte's job is to produce spores through meiosis, and a gametophyte is produced by the germination of the spore. Now you can ask me a question, what is the job of a gametophyte? As the name itself indicates, the gametophyte has a job of producing either male gamete or a female gamete. And when you think of gametes, what comes to your mind? Now gametes have to always undergo fusion by fertilization to form a diploid zygote, isn't it? So 2n. So I'm writing here, the male gamete is also haploid, the female gamete is also haploid. The male and the female gametes later undergo fusion or fertilization to form a diploid zygote, then can you guess what will happen to this diploid zygote? The diploid zygote will give rise to a sporophyte. See the complete cycle here. So first we started with a sporophyte. The sporophyte gave rise to a gametophyte by formation of spores by meiosis. A gametophyte's job is to produce gametes, isn't it? What are the two types of gametes that it produces? It produces male gametes and female gamete. The gametes fuse to form a diploid zygote. The diploid zygote will fall onto a suitable substratum and it will germinate into a diploid sporophyte. So this is why we say that they exhibit alternation of generation. One is referred, and also please remember, wherever you see formation of gametes and fusion, don't you think we say that this is a sexual phase in the life, because it is sexual reproduction? And wherever you see meiosis and production of spores, so don't you think we can call it as the asexual phase in the life? So basically there is an alternation between sexual and asexual phases, that is the sporophyte and gametophyte. Now before we get into the details of plant kingdom, let us look into some of the systems of classification. Earlier, the most earliest, which is not followed any longer, they used to classify plants and organisms just based on observable characters. How they look, where do they live, how do they live, and then what is the color, what is the shape of the leaf. Is this the right way to classify? You may be two different plants, they may look very different to each other, but they may be genetically very closely related. They may be belonging to the same species, and this therefore is not the right way of classifying plants. It is also based mainly on vegetative characters, okay, or such as even characters such as the structure of this is the sexual character, that is the androecium. Androecium is the stamen, whether they have a single stamen or a double stamen or more than two stamens. So it is very loosely based on a set of vegetative and a sexual character, but everything is entirely based on observation, and this was put forth by Linnaeus, the artificial system of classification, which has obviously evolved into further systems that we will be looking into now. What is the disadvantages? It considers only vegetative characters. Vegetative characters is a direct byproduct of environmental changes. It is directly dependent on environmental changes. So the appearance of a plant may keep changing, but that doesn't mean the plant is not related to the other plant, isn't it? Equal weightage was given to both vegetative and sexual characters, although vegetative characters, like we saw, is likely to change with environment. And like I said, if you take only visible characters into consideration, you will end up separating the closely related species, and it does not take any account of evolutionary relationships or phylogenetic relationships. Then came the natural system. This was an advanced system proposed by George Bentham and Joseph Dalton Hooker. So what was the main idea behind the natural system? They took into account the natural affinities. Affinities mean similarities, relationships, and they took into account both external and internal features. What are some of the features? Ultrastructure, anatomy. Anatomy is internal structure. Ultrastructure is if you were to look at a single cell under a high power microscope, you will know the finer details of the cell. That is called as ultrastructure. It took into account the embryology, and also it took into account the phytochemistry, that is the chemicals that are present, which are usually found in plant tissues. Okay, then it also takes into account the different type of floral characters or the sexual characters, and this is something which suits the practical purposes of classification, and we can say that it is somewhat a more scientific method of classification. It doesn't just take into account the visible or the observable characters, it takes a lot of other features into account. Then the last and the most advanced type of classification is the phylogenetic system of classification. This was proposed by Engler and Brandt. And here, as the name itself indicates, phylogeny means evolutionary history, so it takes into account the evolutionary relationships. It considers organisms belonging to the same taxa. It says that if you have to group the organisms, like for example class Mammalia, or if you say any Angiosperm class for that matter, if you say any plant class, all the plants which are present in that particular class, like for example Dicotyledonnae, isn't it? Now you can say that they belong to a common ancestor. Information about various sources has also been considered in order to resolve difficulties. So it not only takes one particular source into consideration, it takes several important, like say for example genetic studies are performed. You can see the similarities that exist in the genetic material so that you can construct an evolutionary tree, isn't it? Then there are several other types of taxonomy that has come into picture of late, that is numerical taxonomy. In numerical taxonomy, numbers and codes are assigned to all the characters and the data are fed into the computer. So you keep feeding every single character and giving importance to it, and you can obviously store a lot of characters in your database, which will help you to classify, which will help you to create a comparison between the organism that you are studying and something that has already been described. Okay, then comes Saito Taxonomy. Saito means it takes into account cytological information, chromosome structure, chromosome number, cellular structure, and also takes into account genetic material, that is DNA, and features of, like for example the DNA sequences. Chemotaxonomy takes into account, like we discussed, phytochemicals. There are so many constituents, chemical constituents, that are produced by the plant as the plant matures and starts undergoing secondary growth. Secondary metabolites whose function in the plant is not exactly known, but we make use of it for our benefit, isn't it? Cladistics, it is a historical order of evolution in various taxa, and cladistics is basically you create a family tree, or what is referred to as a cladogram, and you want to represent that which group gave rise to which group over the course of evolution. So when you construct a family tree, it is called as cladistics. Now moving on to classification of kingdom Plantae. Kingdom Plantae can be broadly classified into Algae, Bryophyta, Pteridophyta, Gymnosperms and Angiosperms. Algae are the most primitive. Bryophytes are avascular, they are green, they don't have any xylem and phloem in them, and they are called amphibians because they are living in moist conditions. Pteridophytes are the ones which are slightly advanced because they are the first ones to develop xylem and phloem, that is the vascular bundles, and they are completely adapted to land, although they may depend on water only for the process of reproduction. Gymnosperms develop seeds and angiosperms develop flowers and seeds which are covered by a fruit wall. So gymnosperms only have a seed, there is no fruit wall, so we call gymnosperms as the naked seeded plants. And so both of these gymnosperms and angiosperms are the first seed plants which we will be discussing in kingdom Plantae. Algae, they may be aquatic, most of them are aquatic, some of them may be growing on soil, on moist stones and wood, okay, and some of them may also grow on sloth bear, that is they are epizoic. Epizoic means they may grow on the surface of other plants. They may exist in the form of a colony, or they may be unicellular, they have chlorophyll in them, and sometimes if they are existing in a tissue like a thalloid, a thalloid like structure means the body has some differentiation, okay, but not differentiation into a root, into a stem and a leaf. There is a primitive form of differentiation that you can see, like for example in the case of brown algae, that is laminaria, you can see that for example in brown algae there will be a basal holdfast, and there will be a stipe, and there will be a leaf like structure that is seen on top, which is referred to as the frond, okay. So a frond, a stipe and a basal cell or holdfast. Now this kind of a distinction where it's not a well differentiated plant body, we call it as a thallus, okay. They may be unicellular and microscopic, they may be colonial and motile like in volvox, or they may be filamentous, unbranched in the case of Eulothrix and Spirogyra. They reproduce by both asexual and sexual methods, and fragmentation, as you know, the thallus breaks into fragments and it develops into, each one grows rapidly into the adult organism. It takes place by the spores that are produced. Now whenever we say asexual reproduction, it may either be spores which don't have any flagella on them, it may be certain thick walled spores which are meant for perennation, that is called as hypnospores, or it may be spores which have flagella. The flagella may be apically inserted like this, or they may have a lateral insertion of flagella like this, pear shaped, tear droplet shaped spores, and these are referred to as the zoospores. So this is how asexual reproduction takes place, and like I said, the zoospores are motile and flagellated, and when they germinate they give rise to new plants. Sexual methods include isogamy. Say for example, the male gamete and the female gamete are both exactly alike. An isogamy where the male gamete, the female gamete is larger and the male gamete is very tiny. And oogamy is where the female gamete is non-motile and the male gamete may be motile with two flagellae. So this is the type of sexual reproduction that you can see. Ultimate goal of sexual reproduction is fusion of gametes resulting in the formation of a zygote. The zygote may or may not enter into a period of rest, which is by the formation of a spore wall called zygospore. And there are so many cases where the gametes, like here I have represented all the gametes which have flagella. If you talk about Spirogyra, the gametes don't have any flagella. They are called aplanogametes. Whereas if you talk about Chlamydomonas, like I have represented here, the gametes have a pair of flagella. They are called flagellated gametes. Okay, now anisogamy, like I told you, you can clearly distinguish between the male and the female gamete. Oogamy is seen in fucus and volvox. Now fucus and volvox is a green algae and fucus is a brown algae, and in this you can see that there is a large non-motile ovum or egg and a motile male gamete. Okay. Now let us see what are the different classes of algae. The first one is referred to as the green algae, that is called Chlorophyceae. Now in Chlorophyceae they have chloroplast, different shapes of chloroplast. Very important point, they have starch as their reserve food material in the form of pyrenoid. Now pyrenoids usually have a protein granule in the center and they have plate-like starch which is present around them. These are referred to as pyrenoid. They have a cell wall. Now for example, if this is the organism with a cup-shaped chloroplast with pyrenoid inside, it has a nucleus. Now I'm showing you a Chlamydomonas. It will have two flagella, a green algae, and you can see that it has an inner wall of cell wall made up of cellulose, and there is an outer wall. The outer wall of the cell wall is made up of a substance that is referred to as pectin. Now these outer walls are mostly made up of substances which are referred to as hydrocolloids because they have a tendency to retain water in them. So cell wall has two layers, an inner layer of cellulose and an outer layer of pectin. Alright, then the reproduction is by fragmentation, vegetative, and I told you in case of asexual reproduction this particular cell itself will undergo the protoplasm inside the cell. See how the cytoplasm inside the cell is dividing into tiny spores. Each spore is a pear shaped or a teardrop shape which has two flagella, and this is what is referred to as the zoospore. Okay, so the protoplast inside, initially these zoospores are naked, they don't have a cell wall, but when they settle on a suitable substratum, they give rise to, or they itself, in this case I'm talking about Chlamydomonas, so there's no question of settling on a substratum. Ultimately these zoospores will develop a cell wall around them and they will start behaving as the adult. It may show an increase in the cell size. Okay, so then sexual reproduction is isogamous. I told you that the male and the female gametes are alike, or anisogamous. There is some difference between the two. Oogamous, where the female gamete is a large oospore, and then sorry, not a oospore, we can call it as egg. Okay, or oogamete, and then there is a male gamete which is motile and flagellated. Okay, See, this is how you can see, this is the parent Chlamydomonas, how the parent Chlamydomonas has given rise to protoplasts inside, which are emerging out by the rupturing of the cell wall, and these are referred to as the zoospores. Gametes are also produced in the same way, and these are the zoospores. See how the zoospores have two flagellae. They have a cup-shaped chloroplast with pyrenoid inside, and they have a nucleus sitting inside the cell. Volvox is a colony. Now if you notice this volvox, it's called rolling algae because it keeps rolling because of its ball-like structure, isn't it? Now if you were to magnify a portion of volvox, you will see there are compartments like this which are made up of cell wall, and each compartment will have a pear-shaped cell sitting inside, and each of these cells are connected. They have flagella which protrude to the outside, which helps in locomotion, and each of them are communicating with each other through plasmodesmata. And chara is an algae which has calcium carbonate crystals in its cell surface. Okay, and then you can see that chara is also monoecious, that is, this particular organism, the main plant body of chara is a haploid sexual body. It has two types of sex organs. Okay, there is a sex organ. Now for example, this is a leaf-like outgrowth. You can see at the axil of the leaf you will find these structures, the sex organs. One will be an oval structure which is the archegonium, and one is the rounded structure which is referred to as the globule. So this is called the nucleus and this is called the globule. These are the sex organs. So we say that sexually reproducing algae, like if you say a thalloid organization like in or a complex organization like in chara, we can also see that there will be differentiation of sex organs. These sex organs are referred to as the gametangia. Okay, so mostly these chlorophyceae exhibit a life cycle called haplontic life cycle. When I say haplontic life cycle, the main plant, the main alga that is represented by the main organism is a gametophyte. When I say it is a gametophyte, it is a haploid plant and it produces gametes, that is male and female gametes by mitosis. Okay, so the gametophyte produces male and female gametes. The gametes will undergo fusion to form zygote. The zygote is diploid. The zygote will undergo meiosis. So zygotic meiosis is very common to form haploid cells, which may themselves behave like the adult, or these haploid cells will grow to become the main plant body, the main thallus, which is a gametophyte. Only the zygote is the diploid phase in the life of this algae. Everything else is haploid. So we say that the life cycle of this algae has what type of a life cycle? A haplontic life cycle. Did you understand what I'm saying? Okay. Phaeophyceae has a haplodiplontic or a diplohaplontic type of life cycle. Okay, because the main plant body is generally a diploid plant body in this case. Okay, now the common example, they are commonly called brown algae because they have, and I forgot to mention, in chlorophyceae they have chlorophyll A. The pigments include chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, carotenoids, very important, and xanthophylls, but mostly it is chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and like we discussed, they store their reserve food material in the form of starch. Now how is this Phaeophyceae different from chlorophyceae? In Phaeophyceae you have different types of photosynthetic pigments like chlorophyll A, chlorophyll C, carotenoids and xanthophylls, and the xanthophyll is referred to as a fucoxanthin, which is a brown colored pigment. So remember that they have a brown colored pigment called fucoxanthin along with chlorophyll A. There is no chlorophyll B here, there is chlorophyll C. Some of them are branched and filamentous like ectocarpus, and some of them can grow several meters in length, and that is referred to as scalps. And like I said, in case of green algae, the outer cell wall had pectin. In these cells, the outer cell wall will contain a hydrocolloid called alginin or algin. Okay, the plant is attached to a substratum. I had told you there is a holdfast, there is a stalk called stipe, and a leaf-like structure that is referred to as the frond. And the most important thing is the reserve food material is laminarin or mannitol. Reproduction can be vegetative, asexual, or sexual. Okay, so now in this case what happens is, I told you about the main plant body, which has a frond, a stipe, and a holdfast. Now generally this main plant body is diploid. It's called a sporophyte. Okay, so this main plant body will contain what is referred to as the sporangia. Angia means vessel, so they are spore bearing vessel which are diploid. This undergoes meiosis to form haploid spores. The haploid spores, so remember, when sporangia, cells in the sporangia participate in meiosis, then we get haploid spores. The haploid spores in the case of brown algae will transform into the next plant body, that is, I had told you in the introduction, that is, this plant which is haploid is called as the gametophyte. The gametophyte's job is to produce male gamete and female gamete. The male and the female gamete fuse together to form a zygote which develops into the adult plant. So you can see that there is both diploid and haploid phases in the life cycle, and therefore we say it is diplohaplontic life cycle. So again here they produce zoospores. Then flagella is lateral in position. Sexual reproduction may be the same thing. There may be a large immotile egg and a small motile male gamete, anisogamous and oogamous. Okay, so in oogamous, like I mentioned, there is a large egg and a small male gamete. Isogamous means both of them are alike. Anisogamous means there is a slight difference. Now these NCERT examples you have to learn. This is laminaria, this is fucus, and this is dictyota. Okay, see, you can here distinguish into a frond, a stipe which is a narrow stalk, and a structure which helps in anchorage. It is referred to as the holdfast. Now rhodophyceae is called red algae. Now unlike the brown algae and the green algae, they have their own red colored pigment that is also called phycoerythrin. They may also have a blue colored pigment called R-phycocyanin. R refers to specific to red algae. They also have chlorophyll A, and they have a special chlorophyll that is referred to as chlorophyll D. See the difference. In chlorophyceae it was chlorophyll A and B. In phaeophyceae it was chlorophyll A and C. In rhodophyceae there is chlorophyll A and D. Okay, they are mostly found in warmer seas and deeper areas where there is limited light. They have an elaborate morphological structure, and some of them are thalloid forms where the body is loosely differentiated into, like how we saw, there's a frond, there's a stipe, and a holdfast, like in the case of Porphyra. And then the cell wall has cellulose and not pectin here. Actually, if this is the cell, imagine this is the cell of a brown red alga. There is a cellulose inside, and outside again, like we saw, there are hydrocolloids which are present, and this hydrocolloid is called a carrageen. Okay, now these hydrocolloids retain a lot of water in them. And how do they store reserve food material? They store reserve food material in a modified form of starch which is referred to as the Floridian starch. Then reproduction again is vegetative or asexual or sexual. The another important interesting thing is they don't have flagellated stages in their life cycle. So even though they produce spores, their spores are non-motile. And again, the male gametes are non-motile, and therefore they are very, very tiny, and the female gamete is large egg, and that's why we say that it is oogamous. And the post-fertilization changes are very, very complex in the case of rhodophyceae or in the case of red algae. Okay, some examples are given over here, that is Porphyra and Polysiphonia. Now moving on to bryophytes. Bryophytes are mostly the amphibians of the plant kingdom. They live in moist and shady and damp and humid places, and they require water for sexual reproduction. That's why they need moist conditions always, and that's why they are called the amphibians of the plant kingdom. The plant body again is not well differentiated into a true root, a true stem and a true leaf, because there's no xylem and phloem here. It may grow horizontally over the surface. So for example, this is the ground. The plant body may grow on the surface of the ground like this, or it may grow upright, like in the case of some of these mosses. Okay, so if it is growing horizontally, it is prostrate, otherwise it may be upright, and there will be these multicellular rhizoids which hold the plant body attached to the ground, and then they contain chlorophyll containing tissue on the upper surface which is exposed to the sunlight. The main plant body is a gametophyte. They have sex organs. The male sex organ is called antheridium, and the female sex organ is called the archegonium. So let us go through a quick life cycle of a bryophyte. Okay, now for example, if this is the bryophyte, let me show you very roughly. This is the ground surface, this is a stem like structure, and there are leaves. Okay, and there are multicellular rhizoids, and you can see there are branches. Let me just show 2 branches here. Okay, now this plant is called a gametophyte. Now this gametophyte is haploid. Okay, now this gametophyte, now as the name itself indicates, it is the one that is involved in gamete formation. So its main purpose is to reproduce sexually. So sexual reproduction. Gameto means gamete and phyte means plant. A plant bearing gametes. So is it the sexual or the asexual generation? It is sexual. Okay, then on these branches, say for example on this branch of this plant and on the upper branch of this plant, on these branches you will find structures which are involved in gamete formation. See, the purpose is to produce gametes. Okay, so on the one of the branches, let us say there is a male sex organ. The male sex organ is called antheridium. Remember, the main plant body is haploid, a gametophyte. So, and the female sex organ, the name given to the female sex organ is archegonium. Yes or no? Okay, now the antheridium will obviously produce the male gamete. Now obviously the antheridium is also haploid, so you can imagine how is the gamete produced. The gamete is produced by mitosis. So male gamete, the name given to the male gamete is anthirozooids. They are generally twisted like this and they are biflagellate. Okay, so anthirozooids are obtained, and the female one, again remember the female branch, the archegonium or the female sex organ is also haploid, so it produces a female gamete. And the name given to the female gamete is egg. It is simply referred to as the egg. So how did this plant produce gametes? By mitosis. So the male sex organ produced the sperm through mitosis, the female sex organ produced the sperm through mitosis. So you saw how the sex organs are present in, it may be on the same branch, but here I have taken, there's a separate branch on the plant with male sex organ, separate branch on the plant with female sex organ. Then the male sex organ makes its way to the egg. How? Through the medium of water. That's why we said that they depend on water for reproduction. They are biflagellate, they swim in the water, they reach the egg. And once it reaches the egg, what is obtained? A zygote is obtained. zygote is diploid. So again I will show you the plant body here. This is the ground, this is the plant body. Say there is a crown of leaf-like structures. Remember, these are not leaves because they don't have xylem and phloem inside them. Yes or no? Okay. Now somewhere here zygote is present. I'm not showing the branches. Okay, let me show the branches for you to avoid confusion. Where did the fertilization happen? Fertilization happened where the egg was present. Where is the egg present? On this branch. Okay, so let me show a branch here. Now here the zygote is present. So this is the zygote. Why I am showing it on this branch? Because the egg did not go anywhere. The sperm came to the egg, isn't it? Now the zygote develops into a new plant which is still attached to this plant. See, this is the new plant. And this new plant which came from the zygote, on the which branch? On the female branch. This is the female branch or the archegonial branch of the moss. I'm giving you example of moss here. This is called a sporophyte. Now can you tell me why we call this sporophyte as a dependent sporophyte? We call it as a dependent sporophyte because it is growing on. Where is it growing? It's growing on the main plant. What was the main plant called? Gametophyte. It cannot lead an independent life. It grows on the gametophyte. See, it is still attached to this plant. This is the gametophyte. The leafy structure is the main plant body is the gametophyte, and the sporophyte is growing on the gametophyte. Sorry. Let me get back to that slide as quickly as possible. I will not be able to draw it again. Let me just show you where I stopped. Okay. So I was telling you that there is a gametophyte and there is a leafy structure, and which is this branch? The female branch. On the female branch a new plant has developed. And this plant that has developed on the female branch is called sporophyte. And the sporophyte is dependent on this plant which is growing below. It is called the gametophyte. Yes or no? And now inside the sporophyte there is a structure, an expanded structure called capsule. In this you can see there are cells. Now this cell that is present inside the capsule is called a spore. Remember, the sporophyte is diploid because it came from a zygote. This is called a spore mother cell. It is diploid. The spore mother cell now undergoes meiosis inside to produce haploid spores. Why? Because it is undergoing meiosis. So these haploid spores coming out of the capsule, can you guess what will they become? They will develop into a new, what is this plant? With leaf-like phylloids, which has a male branch, which has a female branch. What did we call it? Gametophyte. Yes or no? See, how did the spores become gametophyte? Because the spores are haploid, the gametophyte is also haploid. And the same cycle repeats again. So this is called, this life cycle is called, what would you call this life cycle? You would call it as haplodiplontic cycle. Haplodiplontic because the major phase is haploid. Remember, the gametophyte, which is the haploid phase, is the dominant phase in the life cycle. and the short-lived phase is the sporophyte. And I told you the sporophyte is growing on. What is this plant? This plant is the gametophyte. It is growing on the gametophyte. That's why we say that the sporophyte is dependent. In mosses, in bryophytes, along with mosses that I just discussed, where in mosses we saw leaf-like structures called phylloids, there are also certain bryophytes which are called which are thalloid, in the sense that they grow horizontally on the ground surface. See, they have a dorsoventral thallus, a flat thallus, and the thallus usually exhibits dichotomous branching like this, and it grows flat on the ground surface. So this kind of a plant body is said to be seen in a plant that is also belonging to Bryophyta. These are called liverworts. The best example for liverwort is Mercantia. Now if you see this image, now I discussed already when I talk about the image of liverwort, I will show you the picture of Mercantia here. Okay, it's not here, so let me just show you here only. In the Mercantia, now this is the plant body. I have been telling you that the major plant body that is formed is what? It is a gametophyte. Isn't it? On the gametophyte of Mercantia, you will find erect structures with disc-like structures at their end where the sex organs are present. There is a separate male Mercantia and a separate female Mercantia in this particular plant. Some of them have disc with finger-like projections on them. If it is a flattened disc, then we know that it has the male sex organ it is. If it has finger-like projection, then we know that it has female sex organ. So now can you guess what will happen? The same thing. The male sex organ will produce the male gamete, which is biflagellate, and the male gamete will go and fertilize the egg. Correct? And then in this portion, this umbrella-like portion, the egg will develop into a structure. What is the diploid phase in the life called, which is dependent on the gametophyte? It is called sporophyte. By now you know sporophyte is a product of fertilization, so it is diploid. The sporophyte contains spore mother cells which undergo meiosis to produce haploid spores. Two different types of spores are produced. Some of the spores will become male gametophyte, some of the spores will become female gametophyte. So again, what type of life cycle it is? Haplodiplontic. The diplontic phase is represented by a sporophyte. Can the sporophyte live alone? No. It lives on the gametophyte. It is dependent. It is partially parasitic on the gametophyte. And mosses I already discussed. See, this is the capsule. This is the sporophyte. I told you there is a stalk and a seta or a stalk and a foot through which it is attached to this leafy gametophyte. Gametophyte is haploid, sporophyte is diploid. Correct? And inside this I told you there are spore mother cells which undergo meiosis to produce haploid spores. When the haploid spores fall on a suitable substratum, they germinate into the adult, the dominant phase in the life cycle, which is referred to as the gametophyte. Now moving on to pteridophytes. How are pteridophytes different from bryophytes? They are the first ones to have xylem and phloem. They live in cool, damp and shady places. They are also completely adapted for a terrestrial mode of life, but even though they are adapted for a terrestrial mode of life, they require water for fertilization. But here the dominant phase is sporophyte. I will discuss the life cycle in a very simplified form. And surprisingly, the sporophyte is well differentiated into a root, a stem and leaf. Leaves are very small, called microphyles. In case of Selaginella, it is a scientific name, or it may be very huge leaves as in the case of Dryopteris or fern. Okay, now before, if I just read this out, you will be confused. So let me start off with the life cycle of Pteridophyte. So we have the main plant. The main plant is it has leafy structure. It has a leafy stem like this, and it has true roots, obviously, because it is what? It's a plant with vascular bundles. Okay, so this is the leaf of the plant. So we call this main plant body as sporophyte. See the difference. In bryophyte, the main plant body was a what? Gametophyte. Here it is sporophyte. It is diploid. The sporophyte will have special structures on them called sporangia. In the sporangia, there will be diploid cells called spore mother cells. Okay, so this spore mother cell, which is present inside the sporangia, will undergo meiosis to form haploid or diploid spores. Haploid spores. The haploid spore falls on the ground and develops into a heart-shaped structure, which represents a plant which grows flat on the ground, and you cannot even call it as a plant. It is a green heart-shaped structure that is called the prothallus. The prothallus represents what phase in the life? Remember, it came from a haploid spore, so it is haploid. It is called a gametophyte, meaning its job is to produce gametes. So within the prothallus, there will be two types of sex organs. It is bisexual. It has antheridium and it has archegonium. Antheridium is the male sex organ and archegonium is the female sex organ. Correct? Now the antheridium produces the sperm or the antherozoid, and the archegonium produces the egg. The sperm migrate towards the egg and they both fertilize to form a diploid zygote. The zygote will germinate into, because anyway this is also diploid, this is also diploid, so very easily on the ground it will start giving rise to the sporophyte. Is that clear? So the main plant body, so we call this type of life cycle as diplohaplontic, you can say. Why diplohaplontic? Because which is the dominant phase? The dominant phase in the life cycle is a sporophyte that produces spores through meiosis. So there are aggregates of sporangia, this kidney shaped structure. Inside that you have structures called sporangia. Okay, in the sporangia there are cells. What are the cells called? Diploid spore mother cells. The spore mother cells which are diploid, basically sporophyte means it is a plant capable of producing spore. What spores? Haploid spore. How? Because by meiosis. The spores germinate into this heart-shaped, undifferentiated thalloid structure called prothallus, which is a gametophyte. How do you know it is gametophyte? Because it takes part in sexual reproduction. For that it has a male sex organ called antheridium, a female sex organ called archegonium. The male sex organ produces the male sperm or the gamete called antherozoids. The archegonium has egg. They fuse to form a diploid zygote. The zygote develops into the sporophyte. So sporophyte undergoes asexual reproduction and prothallus undergoes sexual reproduction. Okay? Gymnosperms, one stage ahead, they have seed. Naked seeded plant. Seed is there, but it is not covered with what? It is not covered with fruit wall. Okay? Now what is a seed? Now let me tell you in very simple terms what is a seed. Imagine there is a plant, a diploid plant, just diagrammatic. Okay, this is a sporophyte. Here also the dominant phase in the life is a sporophyte. Now let me say it has on its inner angle of the leaf, it has a rounded structure. This rounded structure is called sporangium. It's a vessel which has spores in it. Now in this sporangium there are cells. The cells are called spore mother cells. Okay, now one of these spore mother cells will undergo, say for example this spore mother cell will undergo meiosis. Whenever you think of spore mother cell, it is diploid, it has to become haploid spores. So it produces, this spore mother cell which I saw, it produces 1, 2, 3, 4 haploid spores. And what are these haploid spores now? Now these haploid spores in this plant, let me call these haploid spores as megaspores. There are plants which produce tinier spores called microspores, but here I am saying this is a megaspore. So what will this sporangium be called? It will be called a megasporangium. Normally what should happen is this sporangium should break and all the megaspores should come out. But here this sporangium will not break at all, and some of these megaspores will die and one of the megaspore will remain inside. It says, I don't want to come out of this sporangium. I am very safe inside. I told you that this structure in which the spores are produced are called megasporangium. So this is the megasporangium, and this is the surviving. I told you, so out of these 4, 3 may die out, isn't it? How did these 4 come? Through meiosis. And what is this one cell which gave rise to these 4? Spore mother cell. So the spore, I am repeating again, there is a structure on this plant called megasporangium. The megasporangium has megaspore mother cells. The megaspore mother cell produces haploid megaspore by meiosis. Ideally these haploid megaspores must come out, but they don't come out. Instead the surviving one says, I want to stay inside. Then the question is, what should this megaspore become? What should it become? A spore. Can you recall? Whenever a spore is produced, it germinates to become a gametophyte. Yes. So now this the megaspore which is sitting inside the megasporangium, it develops into, let me show just for diagrammatic purposes, a multicellular structure. It develops into a structure that is called a female gametophyte. See, it is still sitting safely inside. What is this? Megasporangium. This is the megasporangium. It didn't come out. It said, I want to stay inside, and it develops into a female gametophyte. Why is this called female gametophyte? Because it has a female sex organ inside. What is there in this female sex organ? Egg is there. So let me label this circular cell as egg. Because it has egg, I called this as a female gametophyte. Is it haploid or diploid? It came from a megaspore, so it has to be haploid. And the egg also has to be haploid. So it is not going to go out. It is just sitting there. Who has to come in? The sperm has to come in. So there are special methods the sperm, which is mostly motile in this case, is allowed to come in and fuse with the egg. Okay, now what happens to this structure? I don't know where there's no space to draw here. Let me draw here only. So we have a Megasporangium, and we saw there is a tiny gametophyte sitting inside, but now this is not egg. What is it? It has become a zygote. This structure. Now what are the structures here? This one is Megasporangium, this one is female gametophyte, but inside the female gametophyte there is no egg, there is zygote. So this structure is now referred to as the seed. So seed is a Megasporangium with a female gametophyte which is fertilized with a zygote sitting inside. Okay, I tried to make it as simple as possible. Please rewind it and watch it if you have any doubts. Okay, so this is what develops in gym. How did it all start? It started by this rebellious megaspore. It said, I will not go out, I will sit inside and I will develop an egg, I will wait for the sperm to come in and fertilize me, and I will develop into a zygote, but I am still inside the comforts of my Megasporangium, which is on my parent plant. What was the parent plant called? Sporophyte. Alright, this structure, that is Megasporangium with the developing embryo or the zygote, is called seed. So in gymnosperms, like I told you the story of the female sporophyte, correct? I told you that there is a diploid plant which is called a sporophyte, and I also told you that it produces a rounded structure. What did we call this rounded structure? We called it as Megasporangium. Since the Megasporangium, in the previous slide you know that the Megasporangium will end to contain a female gametophyte inside, we call this as a female plant or a female tree. And gymnosperms are usually trees, so the female trees will have a female Megasporangium. And I told you that if this is the Megasporangium, it has what inside it? A megaspore mother cell. Okay, so within the Megasporangium there is a megaspore mother cell which is diploid. She undergoes meiosis to produce what? To produce megaspores. So these tiny cells are megaspores. All this is happening inside the Megasporangium only. Now one of them will survive, but will they come out? They will not come out. Inside the Megasporangium only the megaspore will be sitting. And what does it develop inside the Megasporangium? Inside the Megasporangium, it will develop into a multicellular structure with what in it? Egg in it. What do we call this multicellular structure with egg in it? We call it as the female gametophyte. So what are the structures here? This is the Megasporangium, and now this cell, the structure, the megaspore which didn't want to get out, it is still sitting inside, has become a female gametophyte. In case of gymnosperm, we call the female gametophyte as endosperm. Don't confuse between gymno and angiosperm, because in angiosperm, endosperm is different. Okay, and inside the female gametophyte there is egg. Now I told you it sits inside and waits for the sperm. Where is the sperm coming? It is coming from a different tree, which is this tree now. This tree is referred to as the female sporophyte. It is also a diploid sporophyte. On the male sporophyte, just like we saw on the female sporophyte Megasporangium, on the male sporophyte there is a structure that is called microsporangium. Inside the microsporangium there is a cell which is called, like we called it megaspore mother cell, here we call it as microspore mother cell. Which is diploid. So microsporangium is also a diploid structure because the main plant itself is diploid. Now this microspore mother cell will produce microspores. Again how? By meiosis. But all of them will survive. I told you in megaspore 3 out of 4 may die, but here all the 4 microspores will survive, which are haploid. Now each of these microspore will develop, while they are still inside the microsporangium, they will develop into a 3-celled structure, which is called a pollen grain. The most important cell in this pollen grain is the generative cell. So remember, the pollen grain is coming from the microspore, correct? Which develops into 3 cells, and I am highlighting the generative cell. Now this pollen grain comes closer to the megasporangium. Once it is near the megasporangium, the pollen grain will develop a pollen tube that reaches all the way to the egg. And the generative cell in the pollen grain will give rise to the male gametes, that is the sperm. And what is sitting inside the female megasporangium? Egg is sitting. So this 3-celled structure, that is pollen grain, from the generative cell the male gametes are produced, which will reach all the way. That's why it requires pollination. The pollen gets deposited near the megasporangium. Megasporangium has another name called ovule. Okay, and then this megasporangium has the pollen tube has the male gametes. Actually the male gamete in some of them are top shaped with cilia, rings of cilia, spiral cilia. So they are actually swimming in the cytoplasm of this pollen tube. Their job is to form what? Their job is to give rise to, they fuse with the egg to form a zygote. And then now I told you in the previous slide, the megasporangium with a female gametophyte with a new zygote inside is now called, the egg has become zygote because of the male gamete or the sperm, is now called seed. And the seed will grow to either become the male sporophyte or to become the female sporophyte. Okay, so largely we call this kind of life cycle that is seen in gymnosperm and angiosperm as diplontic life cycle, because the haploid phase is highly reduced gametophyte, how the gametophyte is trapped inside the ovule in case of the female sporophyte. And see, this pollen grain is nothing but the male gametophyte, how it is so reduced. It is so reduced in the sense, how many cells does it have? Only 3 cells. So which phase is reduced over here? Gametophyte phase is reduced. And that's why it is referred to as what? Diplontic life cycle. And generally I told you the microsporangium, the plant which is the male sporophyte bears microsporangium, the female sporophyte bears megasporangium. Generally how this microsporangium is born is, it is born on a structure called cone. On the cone you have these leaf-like structures. If you were to remove one of these leaf-like structures, on the back side of these the microspores are produced. So this is called the male cone, because it is found in the male sporophyte. Where is megasporangium produced? In the female sporophyte. The female sporophyte will have special leaves. These special leaves which bear, see on both sides how these rounded structures are there. These rounded structures are the Megasporangium. On both sides you have, and these leaves which are present on this plant, the female sporophyte, are called what? They are called megasporophylls. They are referred to as megasporophylls. And these leaves on the male cone, you can call them as, because they have microsporangia on them, we can call them as microsporophylls. So the male plant, the male sporophyte has male cone. The female sporophyte has female cone with loosely arranged megasporophyll. Male cone has individual brown colored structures called microsporophyll, which contain, what is this? Microsporangium. The female megasporophyll has these rounded structures, and what is this rounded structure? This is called the megasporangium. Inside the megasporangium there is a megaspore mother cell. Inside microsporangium there is a microspore mother cell. Clear? And the megaspore mother cell and microspore mother cell both undergo meiosis to produce these haploid cells, which are called, in this case they are simply referred to as the megaspore. Here they are called microspore. Microspore becomes a pollen, which is a male gametophyte, highly reduced pollen with 3 cells. Megaspore decides to sit inside. It is not coming out of the megasporangium or the ovule, and inside only it develops into a female gametophyte or endosperm, which has the female gamete. So it doesn't want to come out, so the pollen only goes near to it by pollination, and the generative cell, a tube is formed, and the generative cell will differentiate into paired top-shaped male gametes which fuse with the egg to form the zygote. And this megasporangium or ovule with zygote inside is referred to as the seed, and when the seed falls on the ground, it either develops into the female sporophyte or it develops into the male sporophyte. Okay? Angiosperms. Now, life cycle of angiosperms. How are angiosperms different? Angiosperms are the ones, they have seeds and they have flowers, meaning the seeds are protected. Now think and tell me, what is a seed? I had told you a seed is a megasporangium. It is a megaspore producing structure, and a megaspore inside which develops into a multicellular structure with a zygote inside. What is this multicellular structure? I will think and I will let you think and answer. So this is the ovule, megasporangium. This is the female gametophyte. How did it come? It came from the megaspore, which said, I will not go out of the ovule, I will stay inside and develop. And now there was egg initially, but after fertilization it has zygote. So the zygote which develops into embryo. So post fertilization, the ovule with the developing embryo is called the seed. But in these plants, the seed is surrounded by, you know that there is a swollen structure within which is the ovary in the flower, you have learnt, correct? And in this case we call the ovule as the megasporangium here. So this is the ovule, and inside the ovule there is the embryo developing inside the female gametophyte. So this is the seed, this becomes the seed, and the wall of so this ovule becomes the seed after fertilization, and the ovary becomes the fruit wall. Correct? So what is this ovule? The ovule is nothing but megasporangium, and this inside structure is the female gametophyte which came from the megaspore, and inside now after fertilization there is zygote. Do you know what we call the female gametophyte in angiosperm? In gymnosperm we called it endosperm. Here we call it as embryo sac. Same way, there will be a male part which produces microspores which develop into pollen grain, just like we saw in gymnosperm. But in gymnosperm there were 3 cells in the pollen grain. In angiosperm there is only 2 cells in the pollen grain, that is tube cell and vegetative cell and generative cell. Okay, vegetative cell and generative cells are the 2 types of cells which you find in the pollen grain of angiosperms. In gymnosperms we saw the pollen grain was a highly reduced male gametophyte which has 3 cells. See what I told you? Inside the ovary there is megaspore mother cell, there is ovule. This is the ovule or the megasporangium. And then this is the female gametophyte or the embryo sac. And see how in the anther there is microsporangium which produces through meiosis. It produces microspores, haploid microspores. The haploid microspore develops into 2-celled pollen grain, which is what is this pollen grain I told you? It is a reduced male gametophyte. The reduced male gametophyte, see how it is reaching the ovule, that is the ovule. The embryo sac I told you is the female gametophyte. Inside the female gametophyte there is egg. It is not going anywhere, it is sitting inside the megasporangium. So who has to go towards it? The pollen grain has to produce a pollen tube, and the pollen tube will have gametes in it, and then a zygote is formed. And then there is ovule with the female gametophyte with zygote inside. So what is this called now? Ovule or female gametophyte, ovule or megasporangium, female gametophyte or embryo sac, after pollination and fertilization, zygote. And this is referred to as the seed. And it is surrounded by a fruit wall, ovary wall, which later becomes the fruit. Yes or no? Okay. Then see how the embryo is developing inside the seed, and when you sow the seed, the fruit wall will obviously disintegrate, or you will eat up the fruit, or animal will eat up the fruit and it will disperse the seed, and the seed will grow into a new plant. The new plant is not a gametophyte, it is a sporophyte. Gametophyte is highly reduced, so we say that the life cycle is diplontic, because the major phase in the life of the plant is sporophytic and the reduced stage is called a gametophyte. Alternation of generation I've already discussed. Haplontic life cycle in algae. Diplontic, just now I discussed the reduced female and male gametophyte in case of gymnosperm and angiosperm. Haplodiplontic I have discussed when I spoke of pteridophytes and bryophytes, isn't it? In bryophytes the gametophyte is the dominant phase. In pteridophytes the sporophyte is the dominant phase. And if you were to talk especially about angiosperm, differences between dicot and monocot. You know dicot has 2 seed leaves or cotyledons or embryonic leaves. Dicot has taproot system, monocot has adventitious root system. Dicot has a stalked petiole, but in case of, it has a regular leaf base, but here the leaf base or the hypopodium is, it forms a sheath-like structure which encircles the main stem. The veins are found in the spidery web-like pattern. Here they are parallelly arranged. The floral parts are in multiples of 5. The floral parts are in multiples of 3. The leaf can be clearly distinguished into a abaxial and an adaxial surface, dorsiventral leaf. The leaf is evenly exposed to sunlight on both sides, isobilateral leaf. Okay, so with this we conclude this part of the crash course concerning the chapter Plant Kingdom. Thank you.